makes a fantasy world fantastic to begin with, at least in most cases. Magic is, in almost any society, such a game changer that it would change most aspects of life, everywhere. Of course, all of this depends on the strength of magic, and whether or not it is faintly present or entirely gone, like it is the case in early Game of Thrones, how easy it is to use and who can even use it. But for the sake of illustrating how magic in general would change a medieval fantasy world, we will assume that everyone could potentially learn magic. That some are more interested in magic than others, that magical knowledge and the ability to use magic makes one quite powerful and valuable, far more so than the average human being, and for the sake of simplicity, there is just humanity in this example, because as you will see soon, it gets complicated enough. As for what magic can do, let's say it takes 5 years of studying for a mage to learn basic magic, and 5 more years to be actually useful on his own. And he can then do things like make the soil slightly more fertile for an entire village, if he is given a year time. He can of course cast attack magic, and not something fancy like fireball that would fry whole groups of enemies, because this is something that only very few can do in this fantasy world in this example, but he can summon and fire bullet-like stone projectiles, like 3 to 10 times a day, all depending on the mage's experience and his mana reserves. And of course, he can do things like levitating a bunch of rocks for an hour, rocks so heavy and great that not even 2 or 3 humans could lift them up. Or he could lift smaller bricks for 5 hours a day. And of course, as an average mage, he could do things like remove salt from water, or water from salt, all depending on whether or not the mage is knowledgeable about water or earth magic, and which kind of school of magic he and his teacher would subscribe to. More powerful mages could do things like tame animals instantly, or even fly for 10 minutes or even a couple of hours, if they are really good, talented, and have trained for decades to do so. And finally, healing magic exists. It can't regrow limbs unless you are a master of the craft, it can't even reliably cure a flu or just a cold, but at the very least, it can lessen it. It can also cure or at the very least lessen poison, all depending on the poison in action. And it can also treat fractures, in the sense that the bone will heal quicker. And it can relieve, but most of the time not cure, chronic illnesses and disease. Now, how would all of these by fantasy standards, fairly low-tier magic applications change our medieval fantasy world? Well, for starters, the peasants could be either very free and independent, or just as oppressed as they are or were in our own history. And of course, their status and quality of life would change, all depending on how much and how easy access to magic they get. For here's the thing, peasants originally lived and worked on the land of their lords in exchange for protection. What made this deal quite bad is that peasants could also be drafted for military services. And since the flow of information was quite slow, and a lord could not be everywhere, it made sense to lend some of the land to another trustworthy guy, a vassal, so that they would take care of part of the land in the name of the lord. And in turn he would answer his call to war, or to collect a certain sum of taxes, if the lord commands it. Of course, these minor vassals would in turn subdivide the land from the lord that they have received even further, which made the whole thing even more messier, since every vassal would only swear loyalty to their immediate lord. And this system would not exist in its complexity in this medieval fantasy world. Instead, it would be far more centralized, since thanks to spells like fly, information could travel way faster than it could in our time. So the numbers of vassals would decrease, but on the other hand, knights and cavalry which were the equivalent of a medieval tank, and they were even more effective in the Bronze Age as horse-pulled chariots, and they were faster than infantry, more heavier armored, and just a few hundred cavalry units could defeat a mob of thousands of peasants very reliably. And if a peasant rebellion would break out in a one village, the riders could reach the lord far sooner than the peasant could spread the word and gain allies. So the information flow from village to village would be quite slow. And since the knights are far more mobile, knightly forces could be massed and sent into the fray sooner than the peasants could organize themselves and bring their full numbers to bear, thus destroying the peasant rebellion. And if you add gunpowder and early artillery into the battle, it gets even more one-sided. Not to mention that lords could just hire mercenaries to deal with the peasants. And in the German peasant rebellion, the outnumbered lords could easily, and with very few casualties, put down a far greater rebellious force of peasants, thanks to more advanced technology and better trained professional militaries, mostly in the form of mercenary companies. And if the lords in our own medieval fantasy world would keep a tight grip on magic, their advantage against the peasants would be even more pronounced. But if the peasants could learn magic, even if it is just initially utility magic, that would allow one guy to make the village fields more fertile if he worked a year for it. Then out of this magic tradition, out of the village being able to learn magic and see its effects, could, over the decades and centuries, spring forth a more military-minded base of magic users. Initially they could learn spells like, stone projectile or stone cannon, in order to fend off wolves and maybe some more magical predators, before they turn their magic powers against their lords. And if the peasants have more, or at least the same amount of weapons, and the same options in battle as their lords, their greater number would likely win the day. In order to prevent this, the lords now need to rule the land with more concessions towards the peasantry, and likely with more political power going to the lowest stand, to the peasants, to the normal worker and laborer, thus making the system far more democratic far earlier. Again, if you can use magic. If not, your status in the medieval society would likely be slightly worse than it was in our own medieval timeline. Now, another thing that magic would ensure is that trade would flourish, because trade is most effectively done via ship. No need to maintain an ocean road or something like this, and you can also carry far more stuff via ship than via an ox or mule-pulled wagon or cart, and you also don't need an ox or mule to pull a ship, because the wind will do it for you. And since magic could be used to gain fresh water by again just removing the salt from it, and presumably also be used to preserve food, or at least cure the most egregious symptoms of scurvy, then ships could sail safer and farther away from the coast, especially if magic is also used to navigate. Not to mention that with magic, a broken mast or just the sails could be mended, and the ship would be far less likely to sink, simply because repairs would be more effective. Not to mention that spells of preservation could make the food that can even be taken on the ship without it spoiling in the first few days be more plentiful, varied, and palatable, thus making being a sailor far more attractive. Not to mention that magic spells of detection could be used to root out rats. The flow of information, together with greater ease of travel, would also lead to a more globalized political sphere, since the upper classes, the aristocrats, or the wealthy businessmen could very reliable and safely travel. Another thing that would change without death from disease and injury being that big of a threat that it had been before modern medicine, thanks to healing magic, the aristocrats, or just the wealthy, could fend off death very reliable, because they can buy the best magic caster, they can employ the best magic spells, simply because they are rich. And therefore, this entire magical healing would also stabilize the politics, since now you won't get a war of succession every 20 years or so, but maybe just once or twice every century, with the same political system, simply because people are dying less. So the aristocrats could truly plan for the long term, without these kind of disturbances. And speaking of curing illnesses, cities were a heart of it, due to the close proximity between man and animal, and of course between man and man. Not to mention all of the manure being omnipresent. And therefore disease could spring from animal to human far more easier, causing plagues and other devastating illnesses. But with magic, combined with magic being able to provide clean drinking water to the masses, this would change. Oh, and fun fact, since in medieval times the only real protection people had against contaminated water was to brew beer out of it, since the brewing process killed most of the harmful germs, the population would not be essentially a bunch of low-tier alcoholics all of the time. So the productivity would rise, and things like aggression and infighting or death from alcohol-related disease would be lowered. And I know that beer back in these days was way less potent than it is in our time, but still alcohol is just a cancer-causing neurotoxin, so by reducing its intake to not every single day, the general health of the population would also improve. So urbanization would happen sooner and far more consistently, especially if farming becomes more efficient thanks to magic, so the overall economic output would be far higher than it was in our own medieval world, leading to certain advancements that were not present in our own medieval world to be a normal thing in a medieval fantasy world, such as plumbing, air travel, or just lanterns. And of course, if magic can be used to levitate bricks and gigantic stones, the cities could be built faster and cheaper, as well as roads, mills and other infrastructure important production facilities. Not to mention things to protect us from the environment, such as dikes and dams. And since in our own medieval period, buildings could be constructed over decades and even centuries, truly grand infrastructure projects, akin to perhaps the Three Gorges Dam, or buildings as high as the Burj Khalifa, could also be realized way earlier, although it would take centuries for them to be realized, not to mention the best and brightest builders of their time. Now, despite all of this, life could still be very cheap, and the average person could be quite poor, simply because with more effective ways to cure or at least lessen the impact of disease and injury, the population would grow way faster and also recover quicker from any large loss of life from plague or floods or other catastrophes. And speaking of cheap life, warfare would change drastically. First and foremost, we won't see tightly packed infantry formations wielding pole arms, because they would be obliterated by fireball spells. If magic in military environments is even remotely commonly used, since magic could wipe out tightly packed infantry formation like it is nothing. Unless, of course, counter spells could reliably, and I stress this again, reliably protect most parts of an army under battlefield conditions. Protections against magic, such as runes of warding, magical shields, like those in Harry Potter's Hogwarts battle, or if resistance against magic is something that can be learned, would also be widely employed, simply because it is necessary to survive on a on a magically attacked battlefield. But unless the effect of magic can be reduced to almost obscurity, magic will change the ways wars are fought. And if spellcasters, aka siege level ranged units, are something that can be produced by the hundreds if not thousands, armies would fight much closer to how we fight battles in modern times. In order to avoid area of effect damage, be it from magical artillery, grenades or fireball spells, as well as the far more common small arms, or rather small magical projectiles, such as stone cannons. Because again, if one magic caster can produce even 5 bullets that can cause armor penetration and injury, even if it's not deadly, to a wielder of a shield or to a knight or to some other non-magical protected infantryman, then every single nation needs to change its military doctrine or simply be conquered. The armies would be far more focused on ranged combat, on ranged protection, and on cover, rather than fighting in an open field battle, where armies are sent against one another in line formations or in tightly packed infantry formations. So the medieval and early Renaissance period formation known as Gewalthaufen in German, which literally translated to heap of violence in English, and which were tightly packed infantry formations armed with polearms, would be rendered extinct, one way or another. Not to mention that air power would also be a common factor in these medieval fantasy worlds, at least to World War I levels of relevance. Flying units could scout out enemy positions, could reveal hidden units, or intercept incoming enemy air units, or even redirect or dispel incoming spells, and of course, cover, such as walls or hills or trees, could be somewhat circumvented by simply casting Fireball from right atop of the cover, instead of the fireball being intercepted by a large tree trunk or a wall. The wall would almost protect the fireball from missing its targets, because with one way blocked off for the fire to go, it could more effectively fry the infantry. And if mana can be seen by any magical means, chances are that these air units would also be used to unravel how much energy a given magical unit has left. So equivalent to things like air superiority, surface-to-air missiles, artillery and counter-battery fire, and even electronic and informational warfare, as in blocking out enemy observation spells, would become more important rather quickly. Not to mention with some legendary wizards and witches amassing enough firepower to wipe out dozens of seasoned magic casters, or hundreds, if not thousands of normal units. Not only would these heroes become a factor all on their own, especially when supported by magical units and mounted archers and just good old bow or crossbowmen, but they would also be important political figures, living military weapons, whose favor or ire could decide the fate of entire kingdoms or at the very least individual battles. Lastly, magic casters in general would become a significant political power, just as in our own medieval world, guilds were a thing that organized certain trades into a more powerful political and economic force. Magical guilds would also make sure that the voices of witches and wizards are heard in cities and at court. Now there might not be a single wizard guild that would basically unite all of the wizards and witches, but rather a guild for earth, water, sky, lightning or fire wizards. And there could also be a distinction between civilian guilds focused on things like farming or blacksmithing or building, and more militarized orders. And just as a little addendum, religion would be vastly different from our own world. How different would entirely depend, of course, on the setting, but being confirmedly able to cast spells and being able to confirm that magic exists would have an enormous impact on our own worldview and religious practices. But since this video is long enough already, I think I've learned this overview about how magic would work and change a realistic medieval fantasy world. And of course, these changes are just a few examples of what could be different. And there are many more possibilities, all depending on the magic and the setting. And of course how history plays out in this individual setting. But, and this is the main point of this video, magic should have an impact in most people's life, from the way housing is constructed and how architecture looks, to how warfare is conducted, to how travel and commerce differs from our own world. Basically every single aspect of a life should be influenced in some sort of way. And with that said, I say thank you very much for watching. Be sure to let me know your own thoughts and ideas down in the comment section, and as always, have a nice day.